Hello and welcome to the Carlton Academy's Year 10 lesson on policies towards the Jewish people in Nazi Germany between 1933 and 1935. You should have already completed a starter with your teacher on Teams where you were thinking about what you can remember about the Holocaust from Year 8 lessons and what prior knowledge you have about this terrible, terrible event and something that led to the deaths of 6 million innocent Jewish people. Now, if you haven't already, for whatever reason, put your name on the register on Teams, you need to pause this and go back and do that. It's really important that your teachers know that you're here and that you're engaging with the learning. Let's make a start. So you should already have this title down about how did the treatment of the Jews worsen between 1933 and 1935. Now your teacher will have already been through the different learning outcomes and what you have to do to get certain grades in the lesson. I think what's really important here is that by the end of the lesson, we're at least attempting to make a reasoned judgment about why the Holocaust hadn't become more violent by 1935, because we're going to see it starts with this period of discrimination. Okay, if you haven't already, could you write down the title on your piece of paper for me? So you're going to begin with a video introduction to the Holocaust, and this is quite a harrowing story of what happened to a real person called Arik Hirsch, who was a young Jewish boy at this point. Now, this is all about what happened to Jewish people from 1942, and he talks all about extermination and concentration camps. Now, we're not going to be looking at those in today's lesson because we're going to be thinking about 1933 to 1935. But I think in order to understand the horror of the Holocaust, you need to understand what the end point is and how it was slowly built up to over time. So I want you to watch this video now, but just bear in mind that we're going to be looking at the escalation of the anti-Semitic policies, the anti-Jewish policies that were put in place over time. I think this video is a good introduction because it shows you the horrors of what it is that we're going to look at and the serious nature of what we are studying. So watch this video carefully. You don't need to make any notes during it. You just need to pay close attention to the horrific experience experienced by people like Arik Hirsch.
I was 14 and the wagon was only a very small window. It was hot. We were so cramped we couldn't even sit down. Some people had some water and some people didn't. After 2 days and 1 night, through the wagon I could see assessment with dogs, barbed wire, electric fences. We arrived in Birkenau, Auschwitz. And they said men on one side, women and children on the other side. And we made 2 long queues. Mengele happened to be on the selection platform. He pointed the finger to the left or to the right. I've noticed a lot of people who were chosen to go to the right were fitter men. To the left, children went, mothers with children, elderly men, and I knew that's not a good point. You know, if they don't need you, they kill you and that's it. And then suddenly they tried to take a child away from a mother and she started screaming in the assessment, run towards her. As they run there, I decided to go over to the right. I was very lucky. All the people which went to the left-hand side went to the gas chambers and they gassed them and then burned their bodies. We walked into a place called the sauna, a brick building in Birkenau. And we told to leave all our clothing on the floor. I had 6 photographs of my family, and that's the last time I've had a photograph of my family. I had my hair shaved off, and from there we went into the next room and we had our uniforms, striped suits. It was big on me, so I put it up. They didn't give us any bath or shower. They soon started getting problems with lice. Lice walked around all over us, itchy, very itchy. They live on your skin. We were 1,000 men in a barrack, 3 bunks high, 10 people on a bunk. We slept on the boards. There was no straw and there was no covers. People snored, people moaned, people died next to you. 5:30 in the morning, they woke us up and they allowed us to go to the washroom. In the washroom, there was about 5 buckets of water. And you just dipped your hands, washed your eyes, and that was it. I was just skin and bones because they didn't feed us. They gave us a small piece of bread in the morning with some black coffee made of bent wheat. And lunchtime we got some watery soup with a few leaves swimming around, and that's it. Live on that for months and years going on. You're just like a skeleton. Your mind can't think properly, your body is weak, and you're starving all the time. You think about food all the time. You can't help but think about it. In Auschwitz, I've been tattooed. I got the number B7608 on my left hand. It's still there now, and I just can't take it off. I've lost 81 for my family. I've only found my sister 2 years after the war. How could I say that would change me? I'll never forget what I went through. I suffered so much. It was the most horrific thing any human being should ever see. The world should never see that again.
So you've just heard the testimony of Arik Hirsch. Absolutely heartbreaking what happened to him and so many others. And what I think is most shocking is to think of him as one of the lucky ones that survived, even though he went through those horrendous experiences between the ages of 11 and 16, and even though he lost 80 members of his family. Now, that video that we saw there was talking about what happened in extermination camps, places like Auschwitz, and that did happen from 1942. But first of all, before we begin looking at things like the gas chambers and the mass murders, we're going to first of all be thinking about the period of discrimination. Now, you don't have to write anything down here, you just need to listen, but we will be coming back to colour coding into these 3 categories later. So the first lesson that we're doing today is going to be all about discrimination towards the Jewish people, where they found that their rights were limited. Things like the Nuremberg laws are going to be things that we're looking at today. Now, next lesson, you will then be studying the period of 1938 to 1941, where it starts to turn more violent. There's more outbreaks of violence, and there's things like the Night of Broken Glass, which happens in 1938. Now, at this point, there are lots of Jewish people that are murdered as well as a result of their policies. Things like the Eisengruppen, but also a lot of people die in places like the ghettos, and that's what we're going to be looking at next lesson. Now, the final lesson of when we're looking at the Holocaust is going to be based on 1942 to 1945, which is when the Nazis were putting in place policies like we just saw in that video for Arik Hirsch, when they were carrying out what they deemed as the horrible final solution to the Jewish problem. That's where we get mass gassings, because they wanted to try and kill as many Jewish people as possible and as quickly as possible. So the Holocaust is often divided into these three phases or periods. We're going to have a lesson on each of them, but today we're just focusing on 1933 to 1937. Okay, so we're going to have a quick look at a timeline of the events before we then launch into looking at 1933 to 1935. Now, first of all, if you've already got a printer, then you could print out the sheets and you could highlight directly on the sheets if you wanted to, or you could write on paper. If you haven't got a printer, no problem. All you're going to have to do is write out the events that we've got on this slide and the next, and then you'll be colour coding it afterwards. So when we're colour coding, we're going to be colour coding into these three different categories. You could do this with coloured pens or highlighters, or if you don't have any different colours, then what you could do is you could just use some kind of key system. So maybe a star is the period of discrimination, and a triangle is the period of violence, and so on. So let's go through and talk about the events quickly that we're going to be studying. So first of all, in 1933, we get the boycott of Jewish shops. We're going to be looking at that shortly. In 1933, Jewish workers were also sacked from their jobs. And in 1935, we get the horrendous Nuremberg laws passed, which take away a lot of their civil rights and make Jewish people second-class citizens in Germany. In 1936, discrimination does pause though during the Olympics because the Nazis don't want the rest of the world to see what it is that they're doing. So that's what we need to know for the period of discrimination. The next one, 1938, is part of the period of violence, and it's the Night of Broken Glass that we'll be studying next lesson. So pause the video here to write down those 5 events and then colour code them. Okay, so we're going to do the same with the next events that we've got coming up here, still colour coding them according to those colours from before. So first of all, we have got in 1939 that Jews start to be put into the horrendous ghettos that we'll be studying next lesson. Also, between 1940 and 1941, we have the Eisengruppen, who kill over 1 million Jewish people through terrible mass shootings. And again, we'll be learning about that next lesson. And then the final thing that you need to know about is 1942, we get the start of the extermination camps like Auschwitz, and we get the start of mass gassings that lead to, in the end, 6 million Jewish people being murdered. So pause the video here and I want you to carry on with your colour coding. So the next thing we need to think about is, why did Hitler dislike the Jews? What did he blame them for? Now, I want to be really clear here that these are not accurate reasons. There is no real reason why people were so horrible to Jewish people. But these are the excuses that the Nazis gave for their policies, the reasons they said why they disliked the Jews and why they felt they had a Jewish problem. But remember that Jews here are the scapegoats for Germany's problems. These aren't real reasons. So if you've got the sheet printed out, read through all of these and highlight them. If you don't have the sheet printed, that's not a problem. What I'd do is read through them and then I'd make notes on certain ones. Don't spend ages writing out every single one here. Okay, so let's look through them then. So first of all, we've got one here where Hitler believed that the Germans were the master race. Remember, he believed that Aryan people, people that were traditionally of Germanic origin with blonde hair and blue eyes, were supposed to be his ideal. And he wanted to try and make sure that this master race thrived in Germany. Second of all, he believed that Jews did not have German blood and should not be allowed to live in Germany or hold German citizenship. This is because he believed that Jewish people were plotting to overthrow the master race. He disliked the fact that there were lots of successful Jewish people, and there was a stereotype at this point that Jewish people were too rich and too greedy. Now, the reality is that there were just lots of hard-working Jewish people. For instance, 16% of Germany's lawyers were Jewish. That's not because of some great conspiracy. It's just because people worked hard and decided that they wanted that job, and then they went out to try and get it. Hitler believed, though, that Jewish people were inferior, and he believed that they were subhuman, and therefore he said that they should not be allowed to marry Aryans. He didn't want Jewish people, as he saw it, to pollute German society with their ideas, and therefore he burnt books that were written by Jewish authors. Even people like the very famous Jewish scientist Albert Einstein had to flee Germany as a result of Hitler's policies. Now, the next thing that we need to know about, and this is really important, if you don't have a printer, I still want you to write this one down because it's one of the most important. Germany's economic problems were apparently caused by Jewish politicians who agreed to pay reparations. Remember back in year 9, we learnt about the November criminals who had apparently stabbed the army in the back. Now, some of the politicians that signed the armistice ending the First World War were Jewish, and so Hitler used that as evidence to show that Jewish people had betrayed Germany. Now, this is absolutely not accurate. Not all the politicians who signed the armistice were Jewish, but Hitler used this as an excuse and said that all the economic problems that happened in Germany, things like the invasion of the Ruhr and hyperinflation, he said that was a result of reparations which were caused by the Jewish politicians. He also, and this is another really key one to get down, blamed Jewish people for communism because the very famous man that started communism, which is about sharing resources equally amongst people, was somebody called Karl Marx. And therefore Hitler said that Jews were associated with communism, and because he hated communism, he therefore hated Jewish people. That's another really key one. And the final really key one to make sure that you get down in your notes is that Hitler believed that Germany had lost the First World War because of the Jewish politicians in the Weimar government who had signed the Treaty of Versailles, even though Germany hadn't lost the war. He basically saw Jewish people as weak, and as a soldier in the First World War, he was particularly upset about it ending. He couldn't understand that Germany was actually losing for a while, and German propaganda had just lied about it. So there are lots of different reasons there why Hitler didn't like Jewish people, and lots of different ways that he wanted to try and hurt them. What you need to get down is at least those 3 ones that have been circled. You can write down some more if you want to, for instance, about the master race, if you wanted to. So pause the video here to make some notes on those areas, and also make sure you get this key point here in red, no matter what, about the fact that the Jewish people were scapegoats for Germany's problems. They weren't really responsible, but anytime there was a problem, they blamed the Jewish people because it was easier than talking about the real reasons why they were struggling. So now we're going to be moving on to looking at the first event, which is the boycott of Jewish businesses. Now, I thought first of all I'd show you this image so you can see what it looks like, with the fact that we've got some SA men here. They are the brown shirts. This is happening in April 1933, before the Night of the Long Knives. They're still around at this point, and they were standing in front of Jewish shops saying, "Don't buy from the Jews," and intimidating all the people into not shopping in those locations. So we'll look at more detail now on the next slide. So here we've got some key points about the boycott of Jewish businesses that happened on the 1st of April 1933. They actually only lasted for a day, but they still had an impact after that as well. As I read through these, I'd like you to make some bullet pointed notes. You don't have to write down every single thing that's on here, but you need a quick little summary about the boycott of businesses from 1933. The Nazis started this campaign on the 1st of April and tried to stop Germans from using Jewish shops. They wanted to harm them economically and financially, but they also wanted to show that they were somehow different to the rest of the German citizens. So they made the SA stand outside these places of businesses with signs saying things like, "Germans, a warning to you, don't buy from the Jews." And the idea is that they're going to intimidate would-be customers and stop them using those shops. Now, not all German citizens agreed to this. Not all of them, left those Jewish shops alone. Some of them defiantly used the Jewish shops anyway to show that they disapproved of Nazi policies. Remember, at this point in April 1933, the Nazis haven't consolidated their position. President Hindenburg is still alive. Hitler isn't yet dictator, and therefore people aren't that scared of the Nazis at this point. They don't really know about the brand new concentration camps, and therefore people are much more likely to oppose the Nazi policies. Even though some people continued to use their businesses, this still had a massive impact on Jewish business owners, and many were eventually ruined by this boycott because customers wouldn't go in them afterwards, even once the SA was gone. So for the Jewish people, it was absolutely horrendous, and this was such a sign of things getting worse that actually 37,000 Jewish people left Germany in 1933 alone. So pause the video here and make some quick notes about what happened in 1933. Now, other things that happened in 1933 that weren't mentioned on the last slide are that the Nazis tried to push Jewish people out of loads of different jobs. For instance, they prevented them from being people that worked in the civil service, lawyers, or doctors that treated ordinary German people according to what the Nazis categorised as ordinary Germans. So they did try and push them out of loads of different jobs. It might be worth adding that to the bottom of your boycott notes that in 1933, Jewish people were excluded from many professional jobs. But things get even worse in 1935 when the Nazis passed something called the Nuremberg Laws. We're going to talk through what they are in more detail in a second, but first of all, I want you to watch this documentary clip which is going to introduce you to them and the horrendous impact that they had on so many Jewish people.
Elspeth married Siegfried in 1930. 5 years later, such a union would have been impossible.
Marriages between Jews and German citizens or those of similar blood are forbidden.
The marriage law, one of the Nuremberg decrees of 1935, was aimed at protecting the purity of German blood. The Nazis divided people into racial types. They said Germans were descended from the Aryan race. This propaganda film shows Aryans of old, the Teutonic Knights, supposedly the root of all German culture and nobility. Pure Aryan Germans could be recognized from their blonde hair and blue eyes. It was all a fantasy, but the fantasy was dressed up as science. Germans were being taught to think of other races as somehow less than perfect. And the German people bought the lie. Signs cropped up. Jews not wanted here. With the Nuremberg decrees, this discrimination was set down in stone. German Jews lost their citizenship. They lost the right even to call themselves German.
So we've now seen about the impact that the Nuremberg laws had on so many individuals. Now down the left-hand side, we can see some examples of some of the official and unofficial Nuremberg laws. Now, normally we would do lots of discussion in lesson about this and think about how these would affect the Jewish people and which one you would be most upset with if you were a Jewish person living in Germany. Now, obviously, we can't do discussion in the same way, but before you move on to the next slide of making some notes on the Nuremberg laws, I'd like you just to pause here for a second, look at these different Nuremberg laws down the left-hand side, and then message me on message me on Teams in the Q&A box with which one you think would upset you the most and why. And then you can move on to the next slide after and look at what the Nuremberg laws actually did. Okay, so we need to know about the Nuremberg laws. I'm going to need you to make some notes based on the information on this slide. So first of all, you're going to need to put a new subheading of 1935 Nuremberg laws, and you're going to need to make some notes about the official and unofficial laws that they passed. So first of all, there were two really important Nuremberg laws. The first one said that you could only be a German citizen if you had purely German blood, if you were somebody that they saw as Aryan and part of what they called the master race. If you weren't somebody that was a German citizen, you had less rights. This was a really big deal, and they were essentially making German people that were also Jewish second-class citizens. They also now said it was illegal for Aryans and non-Aryans to be married or in any kind of relationship, and you could be put in a concentration camp if you went against that law. So people that were already married ended up having to separate or risk being imprisoned, and it must have been absolutely heartbreaking for those people. But not only was there those two official ones, there was also a lot of unofficial ones that were put in place by ordinary German people who were inspired to act by the Nazis. For instance, if you were a Jewish person, you would quite often find Jews not welcome signs being put up across Germany. They'd be in places like restaurants, even on things like park benches. They'd tell them that they weren't allowed to sit there. Books by Jewish authors were burned in book burnings. You've seen pictures of them when you did the propaganda lesson. Even books by people like Einstein were burned. Jewish people also couldn't do ordinary recreational activities like going swimming or even owning a bicycle. And even during the Second World War, they banned them from even doing things like buying chocolate. So loads of different things that Jewish people can't do. And essentially they're being shamed into retreating and not being part of this public life anymore with the other German citizens. So what I want you to do is to make sure that you've got some notes on those Nuremberg laws, and then afterwards to write down some ideas about what impact would those laws have on the lives of Jewish people. So pause the video here to be able to make those notes. Now, this isn't something that you need any notes on, but I think it's worth talking about. Now, normally at this point in the lesson, some student in the class has asked me, well, why hasn't it turned violent by 1935? Why is there not the mass murder at this point, 2 years into the Holocaust? And these are the kinds of ideas about why it hasn't turned violent. So first of all, we need to remember that this is only 2 years into the Nazi regime, and they don't yet have a strong enough hold on power to risk doing something that may push the German people into open rebellion. He doesn't know how the people will react, so we're going to see that Hitler starts putting in place these things that upset Jewish people, but they escalate over time. They get worse and worse over time because he's basically dipping his toe in the water and kind of seeing what is the reaction of German people. To some extent, the fact that the German people don't do anything when it comes to the boycotts means that Hitler is then encouraged to do things like banning them from certain professions, like we talked about before, with them being banned from being doctors and lawyers and working in the civil service. And then the fact that he gets away with that and nobody has any kind of outcry about it means that Hitler can then do the next most extreme thing and build on what he's doing before, and that's when he then passes the Nuremberg laws. So we're going to see that things get worse and worse over time because Hitler feels more confident with doing that, but also because over time the amount of Jewish people that are under Nazi control increases, especially after Hitler invades places like Austria in 1938 and when he invades places like Poland in 1939. For instance, in Poland, there are 3 million Jews, which is a lot more than the 500,000 that there were in Germany. But there's also this idea that Hitler hadn't necessarily planned to murder all these people in 1935. Historians are still debating to this day about when did Hitler make that decision. Did he just want to get rid of Jewish people by deporting them? Or at this point, had he already made the decision about murder, but was just building up to it? It's something that is still hotly debated, and we'll talk about that in the final lesson that we're going to do on the Holocaust. So you don't need to pause it or make any notes at this point unless you want to. Now, after 1935, things go quite quiet when it comes to the Holocaust. Obviously, the Jewish people are still living with this terrible discrimination and the results of the Nuremberg laws, but things don't escalate further because of the Olympics that happens in 1936. Now, obviously, Hitler wants to showcase Germany in a positive light. He wants other countries to be jealous and to be mesmerised by the success of Germany. He doesn't want them to be focused on his anti-Semitic legislation. And therefore, in 1936, they temporarily halt discrimination against Jewish people because they don't want there to be any kind of consequences with other nations maybe putting in sanctions for their mistreatment of this group of people. So things actually paused during the Berlin Olympics. So now we're going to think about the reaction of the German public to this discrimination. We've just mentioned already that in some ways it escalates over time because nobody stops Hitler. Nobody has this mass outrage and outcry about what they're doing. You're going to need to bear all of this information we're going to talk about in mind because I'm going to ask you to answer this question on your piece of paper once I've talked through it, and then you're also going to be discussing your ideas on teams for the last part of the lesson. So first of all, some Germans did take on these anti-Semitic legislation, take them really seriously, and like the fact that they were punishing Jewish people for just being Jewish. So there were some people that liked it. However, there were some people that didn't like the way that it was so obviously discriminating against the Jewish people. For some people, it made them quite embarrassed of what was going on, and they carried on being friends with their Jewish friends as they were before. Some of them carried on seeing their Jewish doctor as they did before, and some of them carried on reading Jewish authors like they did before. So for lots of Germans, they carried on as normal, and they found it quite embarrassing what was going on with the German Jews. And as we can see here, open opposition to discrimination was rare. Some people were embarrassed by it and didn't necessarily like what was going on, but it was really rare for people to actually voice that strongly, to stand up and say it was wrong. Most people that were unhappy with discrimination just kept their heads down, kept their thoughts themselves, and prioritised their own self-preservation over standing up for other people. So essentially, most people responded either by ignoring it or liking it. So there wasn't really any kind of outcry in favour of supporting Jewish people and saying this was wrong. Now, the Nazis didn't escalate anti-Semitism after the Nuremberg laws because of the Olympics, as we've already mentioned. It's not like they didn't escalate it because the people of Germany clearly weren't for it. The only reason that they stopped it is because of the international reputation of Germany. So we're going to see next lesson that because lots of German people don't stand up, things get worse and worse over time with the Night of Broken Glass that we're going to look at next lesson. You're now done with all the notes for today. Can you please go back to Teams to be able to complete your plenary? If you happen to have finished before the last 5 or 10 minutes when your teachers ask you to come back, just let your teacher know, as they'll give you the extension task to be able to complete.